Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I'm so glad that you can. Today we're going to study the book of Nehemiah, the first 6 chapters. I don't know about you, but I just love the book of Nehemiah. There's so many valuable lessons for us that kind of relate to our everyday life. And a lot of leadership stuff that goes in there too, but we're going to try to make this as real and practical as we can today. Kind of get down everyone's level. Before we begin, just some interesting little facts to deal with. It's probably been 160 years since the wall has been torn down and the gates burned. It's been 72 years since the temple was completed. 94 years since the Jews were allowed to go back, and probably 14 years since Ezra had arrived, that Nehemiah takes place. The other thing that's interesting here is the opposition that takes place in the book and how Nehemiah deals with that. And we'll point that out as we go along. But something else is, in the time of Ezra, Artaxerxes, who's now the king, that Nehemiah is serving as the cupbearer, had stopped the building of the wall. It had started, but the same men who tried to stop Nehemiah wrote back to Artaxerxes and basically told him, listen, these people are building the wall, and if you let them keep building the wall, then they're going to become a bigger nation. They're going to defeat you. And so Artaxerxes had them stop building the wall. And so in just a moment, when Nehemiah goes to the king and the king asks him what's wrong with him, he's going to the same man to ask for permission to build the wall that stopped the building of the wall. And I think that's significant. Basically, what Nehemiah is going to say is there's going to be opposition, but listen, life is going to be okay. Everything's going to be all right. When Nehemiah goes back to Jerusalem, they call it beyond the river, he's going to travel about 1,000 miles. But first, while Nehemiah is serving as the king's cupbearer, the cupbearer was the fellow who tasted the king's food, and he also made sure the drink of the king was not poisoned. He stood close to the king. He was a real confidant of the king. If the king couldn't trust the cupbearer, he probably would be poisoned, or somehow people would get in to assassinate him. So he really was dependent upon the cupbearer for his safety and security. Well, when Nehemiah hears about it, about how the condition of the walls, he is just torn up about it. Nehemiah's never lived in Jerusalem. Nehemiah's been in captivity, and now he's under a Persian king. Artaxerxes is a Persian king. And his heart is just broken because his people are suffering. And there's no protection. A wall meant protection and blessing by God. God would bless them by protecting them. And there's nothing to protect them now. I mean, it had been started, but by political maneuvers, it had been stopped. And so one day, when Nehemiah is going about his work, the king sees Nehemiah because he sees him every day. He knows when he has a smile on his face. He knows when he's real down. And Nehemiah's down. I mean, it shows all over his face. And the king says, hey, man, what's going on with you? Why are you so upset? And he tells the king, look, my people back in Jerusalem are hurting. And I sure would like permission to go back and rebuild that wall. And the king says, sure, man, go ahead. And Nehemiah says, well, can I ask you for a few things? Can number one, I ask you for a letter to give as I go along to the governors along the way? Because some of them are the very ones that wrote you before telling you to stop the building of the wall. Can I also have permission to cut down trees from your forest to help with the building of the wall? Can I have that permission? And by the way, to boot, the king also sends some Persian soldiers along with Nehemiah back as well. And those soldiers are going to become important in just a few moments. So Nehemiah gets permission from the king, and he goes back to start rebuilding the wall. So we come to chapter 3. And chapter 3 is really an interesting chapter. It's a chapter with a bunch of names that we can't pronounce. It's a chapter that says, and next to them, and then, and next to them, and then. We can expect struggles and hardships when we try to live a life that pleases God. Opposition is going to be raised if we try to stand to a point of obeying God. But now then, Nehemiah does something that's really genius with these people. He takes all the people And instead of trying to build the wall all at one time, he puts each family in their place and each craftsman in his place, and says, what I want you to do, I just want you to worry about this section of the wall. That's all you have to worry about. Nothing else. You build your section. And by the way, that section they're going to build is also out front of their house, their home. So obviously they want to build that to be secure for their family. If you look in Jordan's little book that he gives on captivity and return, look at what he says on chapter 3, Nehemiah chapter 3. Jordan lays this out really well. Everyone had a task. Nehemiah got everyone involved. There are 38 individuals and 42 groups mentioned in this chapter. There were priests and city officials, city guards, temple servants, bachelors, and women. Everyone helped. Second, each had a manageable section. There's nothing more frustrating than biting off more than you can chew. But here Nehemiah divided this massive project into 42 manageable sections. And third, he says each had a personal connection to the work. Each of the portions the people worked on was given based on where they worked and where they lived. And so the people are going to really protect themselves when they build in front of their homes. But wouldn't you think that got started off relatively good? I mean, the king's given permission. Nehemiah's gone back. He's got the lumber now to build. He's got permission to pass through the different areas to go back in the 1,000-mile journey he's traveling back. But we come to chapter 4. In chapter 4, things kind of take a downhill turn because opposition comes. Opposition comes in the form of Sanballat and Tobiah. In verse 1 of chapter 4, it says that Sanballat is just furious. He is indignant. He is angry against them. And look at what it said, how he approaches this in verse 2 of chapter 4. And he spoke before his brethren and the army of Samaria and said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of the rubbish, stones that are burned? What he's saying is, you're a bunch of weaklings. Who do you think you are to rebuild this wall? You see what he's doing? He's despising them. He's mocking them. When people do something to us from the outside, that is, there's something that attacks us physically, we can handle that pretty good. But here this guy's mocking them. He's insulting them. That becomes personal. And he's trying to just get them discouraged to quit. In fact, go on, it says, Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him and said, whatever they build, even if a fox goes on it, he will break down the stone. Look at that. They're building this wall. They're a bunch of weaklings. You think you can build this wall? I tell you what, you go ahead and try. But when you get done building that wall, even a fox can breeze on it. Looking back at chapter 2 and verse 19, we didn't read this. We told the story. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard of it, that is, what he's going to do in rebuilding the wall and having the king's permission, they laughed at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you are doing? Will you rebel against the king? Well, notice what it said in verse 18. And I told them of the hand of my God, which had been good upon me, of the king's word that had spoken to me. So they said, let us rise up and build. Let us set our hands to the work. Nehemiah said, look, I not only have God on my side, I have the king on my side. And the people said, let's rise and build. And then Tobiah, Sanballat, and Geshem said, are you going to despise the king? Is that what you're going to do? And notice how Nehemiah answers in verse 20, chapter 2. The God of heaven himself will prosper us, that we, his servants, will rise and build, but we have no heritage or right, but you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem. Notice he says, God's on our side. You make all the insults you want. You can try to tear us down. You can try to make us quit, but we're not going to quit. And so back to chapter 4, you have the insults, and assaults that are attacking. Look at what Nehemiah does in chapter 4. Hear, O God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their heads and give them as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity, that is, forgive them. Do not let their sin be blotted out from before you, for they have provoked you to anger before the building. I said this in the beginning. One thing we begin to see about how Nehemiah answers the problems is he always prays, then he acts. He always prays, then he prepares. Nehemiah doesn't act first and say, oops, I guess I should ask God about it. No, Nehemiah prays, and then he acts. And so here you have Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem. They're all meeting there together. and they're all trying to set a trap for them. And so notice what happens, verse 6, after they pray. So he built the wall and the enemy, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. What'd they do? They stopped working? No, they got back to work. But notice verses 7 through 9, another fight is coming. Another fight is coming. It says, now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard of the walls of Jerusalem were being restored, and the gaps were beginning to be closed, that they became angry. And all of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. Nevertheless, we made our prayer to God. Because of them, we set watch day and night against them. Here again, you see the mocking that's taking place. And you see what he says. We prayed to God and we prepared. We prayed to God and we prepared. We're ready for the fight. Then notice verse 10, another attack comes. Then Judah said, the strength of the laborers is falling, and there's so much rubble that we are not able to build a wall. People are coming from the outside, and they're saying, this is too hard. You have no right. You have no right to do this. You have no right to build a wall. Well, they may not have the right, and they may not have the ability. In fact, notice they say something true here. Verse 10, there's so much rubbish that we're not able to build the wall. They're right about that. They're not able to build the wall. But God is. God's able to build a wall. So you have the attack from the front by insults. You have attack from the outside coming in with rumors. But notice what he says in verse 11 and 12, another attack. And our adversaries said, they will neither know nor see anything until we come into their midst and kill them and cause the work to cease. So it was when the Jews who dwelt nearer them came, and they told us 10 times, whatever place you turn, they will be upon us. So here you have attacks and threats. They're going to attack you. You're not even going to see them coming. This is going to be a surprise attack. They're going to kill you. The surprise is coming. They're going to get to you. They're coming to Jerusalem. They're bringing also not just attacks, but rumors. Notice what he says again. He says, nevertheless, we made our prayer to God, verses 11 and 12. He says, verse 11, then they will neither know nor see anything till we come into their midst, until the work is ceased, and we'll say this 10 times. They're spreading rumors about them, and they're going to attack them. Threats and rumors. But notice Nehemiah's response. Verse 13. Therefore I positioned men, and behind the lower parts of the wall at the openings, I set people according to their families, with their swords and bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles, the leaders, to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, for your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. What did Nehemiah do? Nehemiah is smart. Where are people going to attack? At the weakest point. Well, half the wall's built. They're going to attack where half the wall's built. And what does Nehemiah do? Nehemiah sets guard. He sets special guards there. He sets a group of special guards to stand against a threat. You know, Satan always attacks us at our weakest and most vulnerable point. It presumes we know our weakness, of course. It assumes we know that. But we need to post guards where we're the weakest. And then Nehemiah speaks these encouraging words. Remember the Lord. He'll fight for you. You're not fighting for yourself. You fight for your families. The Lord will fight for you. So Nehemiah prays, and he prays, and he prays. And he prepares, and he acts, and he sets these guards. Nehemiah is not going to be taken by surprise. But notice what happens in verse 15. It happened when our enemies heard that it was known to us that God had brought their plot to nothing, that all of us returned to the wall, everyone to his work. Notice going back in verses 11 and 12. It says, and our adversaries said they will neither know nor see anything till we come. In other words, they think they have a secret plot. They think they have a great secret plot that's taking place here. They're going to surprise them. But no, Nehemiah says, no, we found out all about your plot. We found out all about it. And we're not going to be surprised at all. They were going to be ready. They're going to be prepared for the attack that's there. And so it says then in verse 19, then I said to the nobles, the rulers, the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive. We are separated far from one another. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us. Our God will fight for us. Nehemiah noticed one thing, though. They're beginning to be separated. You see, the wolf will try to drive one sheep off from the flock. And he separates that one lamb from the flock. That one lamb is easy prey for the predator. And Nehemiah's looking. Everybody's got a sword in one hand and a tool in the other hand, and they're building this wall. They're set guard. Everyone's building their spot that Nehemiah has assigned to them. But he notices we're separated. That's our weakest point. We're in danger. So what I want you to do is when you hear the sound of the horn, you run, you come, you ride to us. Our God will fight for us there. And so he says, we weren't taken off guard. We were prepared. We were prepared for what took place. Well, we come to chapter 5 and 6. And chapter 5 is all about trouble from the inside. You know, it's one thing to have trouble from the outside. It's another thing to have trouble from the inside. And what's happening here is not just Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem that's taking advantage of them. Now their own people are taking advantage of them, of each other. You see, what happened is the famine came. There was a famine that's here. And you had the poor people and you had the wealthy people. The wealthy people didn't suffer. They still had their food. But the poor people had to sell their land, their vineyards, their sons and their daughters in order to provide food. Who are they selling it to? The wealthy. And what are the wealthy doing? Well, they're charging interest. And they're making the burden even heavier. And a lot of time in the Old Testament, when slavery took place, it was because of famine or some disaster like that, and a person had to sell his family to provide. So they're sold into slavery to provide for food. Well, so here these nobles, these officials, they're charging interest and making the burden heavy on their people. Turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 23 real quick. Turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 23 with me real quick. Deuteronomy chapter 23. And look at verses 19 and 20. 23, 19, and 20. Notice what he says. You shall not charge interest to your brother, interest on money or food or anything that is lent out at interest. To a foreigner you may charge interest, but to your brother you shall not charge interest, that the Lord your God may bless you in all to which you set your hand in the land which you are entering. What are they doing? They're violating the law. They're violating the law. Now, under the Persian rule, see, Israel's no longer a nation at this point. Now they're under the Persian reign, and Artaxerxes is the king. They live to please a foreign king. They've been pressed by foreign nations. They've been oppressed by foreign nations for 100 years now. And Nehemiah heard about these rumors. And he says, can't you see what's happening here? Can't you see we got the enemies on the outside attacking us, but can't you see how we're taking advantage of one another here? And what he says is, that's not right. And furthermore, you're violating the law in doing so. And Nehemiah said, look, I'm going to call everybody together. I'm going to get all these people involved together, and I want it stopped. I want it stopped now. And Nehemiah even uses himself as an example. In fact, notice what is said in verse 12. When Nehemiah challenges them, they said, we will restore it, we'll require nothing from them, we'll do as you say. Then I called the priest and required an oath from them that they would do according to their promise. So Nehemiah calls all these people charging interest together, and they said, okay, we'll stop. And Nehemiah said, by the way, since Nehemiah's been there, he's been appointed governor. He had the right to the food allotments. He had a right to charge the interest on the food because the Persian king allowed that. Not right by law of Moses, but right because he's serving a Persian king. Nehemiah said, I didn't charge him anything. In fact, I gave them food. In fact, I even lent them my own money. But the people said, okay, we'll stop doing it. And they genuinely repented of it and restored all that had been taken. Nehemiah said, I had a food allowance, probably to feed about 100 people a day at his table. But he said, I didn't do what you did. He set the example of how they ought to treat their brother. And so then we come to chapter 6. And chapter 6 is really interesting because you've got the threats, they're kind of ramping up a little bit. So it says the first part of chapter 6, it happened when Sanballat Tobiah, Geshem, the Arab, and the rest of the enemies heard I'd rebuilt the wall, that there were no breaks left in it, though at the time I had not hung the gates. Sanballat and Geshem said to me, saying, Come, let us meet together among the villages in the plain of Ono, but they thought to do me harm. Just to kind of give you an idea on the map of where this is taking place. You have Sanballat up here, and here's Ono, Tobiah, and Geshem. And so Sanballat and Tobiah said, hey, meet us in Ono. I'll show you another little map here to kind of give you an idea of the distance that's here. And so here's Jerusalem. Sanballat's up here. Here's Jerusalem, and Ono is 37 miles. And so we want you to leave building the walls here, and want you to travel 37 miles to meet us. But Nehemiah knew something. He knew it was a trap. He knew what they were going to do is they were going to assassinate him. So Nehemiah said, "Oh no," to their appeal to come to "Oh no." Nehemiah knew what they were going to do. And look at what happens again. Look at what happens. Verse 3, so I sent messengers. Verse 4, they sent me this message. Verse 5, Sanballat sent his servants. You see the pressure they're putting on him? They're repeating it. They're sending the servant, each servant. They're relentless in what they're doing and appealing to Nehemiah. And then notice what happens in verse 6. It was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem says that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall that you may be their king. What Sanballat says is, look, I looked on the internet. This is what I found on the internet. And because it's on the internet, it must be true. And I read where Geshem was the reporter, and he said, you're trying to rebuild the wall. You're going to rebel, and you're going to be king. You see what that was? That's a charge of insurrection. You're going to overthrow Artaxerxes. And Sanballat also wants Artaxerxes to hear this. But Artaxerxes knows Nehemiah. So here Sanballat said, I've been surfing Google. I saw the internet, this report by Geshem. Of course, if it's on the internet, it must be true that you are going to rebel and you're going to be a king. And so verse 8, it says, then I said to him, no such thing as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart. For they're all trying to make us afraid, saying their hands will be weakened in the work, and it will be done. We're not going to panic. No, you're just telling a lie. That's not what's happened. You're making this up. It's baseless. It's a baseless attack against the enemy. It's fake news that they're pointing out. And notice what Nehemiah does then next at the end of verse 9. Now, therefore, God strengthen my hands. He prays again. Nehemiah prays, then prepares, then acts. We see that all the way through the first 6 chapters. Well, something else happens in verse 10 and going forward. What you have here is Shemaiah. He's hired by Sanballat and Tobiah. And he's hired to lie to Nehemiah and say, come to the temple and hide. And Nehemiah said, I'm not going to hide. And the reason they wanted him to come to the temple to hide was because if he came in the temple, Nehemiah knew he should be in there. They would be able to charge him as being in sin. They couldn't charge him for anything else, but they have a charge of sin against him. But Nehemiah's smart. He's wise. He said, no, this is a trap. I'm not hiding there. You're a hired man, and all you're doing is you're telling lies. And notice what he says in verses 14 and 15. May God remember Tobiah and Sanballat according to these their works, and the prophet Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who would have made me afraid. He prays again. This time he prays and says, God, please don't cover their sins. I pray to God that you punish them. Well, now the wall's built. And guess what happens? Look in verse 16. It happened when all the enemies heard it. All the nations around us saw these things, that they were disheartened in their own eyes. They perceived this work was done. This work was done by our God. Oh, wait a minute. This wasn't Nehemiah building the wall. God was doing this. And now who's afraid? You see, all the enemies are trying to make Nehemiah and all those who are building the wall afraid. But now the tables are turned. Now they're afraid because they realize the wall's been built and this was built by God. That's powerful, isn't it? But something happens in verses 17, 18, and 19. In those days, the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah. Letters of Tobiah came to them. You see, they're nobles. Tobiah's on the outside, nobles on the inside. So they're sharing inside information back and forth to Tobiah. Tobiah's on the outside. You see, Tobiah and his son had married into Jewish nobility. And the people were related and swore allegiance to Tobiah. And so they're more faithful to Tobiah than the Lord. And so verse 19 says, as they reported his good deeds before me and reported my words to him. They're two-faced. They're saying one thing here and one thing here. They reported back to Tobiah everything that happened while they're saying good things about me. Well, Nehemiah had his hands full, didn't he? He had his hands full with the people because they're complaining about how they were treating one another. He has hands full by the enemies on the outside, trying to intimidate him, trying to mock him, trying to discourage him, trying to tell lies about him, trying to threaten him, trying to spread rumors about him. But every time Nehemiah responds, he begins his response with prayer. With prayer. Let's look at George's book just a little bit, and let's know some applications that George makes. On Nehemiah chapter 1 and 2. In Nehemiah chapter 2, when he arrives in Jerusalem, before he assembles the people and puts them to work, Nehemiah inspects the city and the walls. There's an important reason why. Vision begins with the end in mind. One of the key characteristics of good leadership is vision. No, not eyesight. It's the ability to see ahead, to make plans, and to chart a course to set a direction, setting goals. Before Nehemiah left Persia, he had a vision of what he wanted to do. So he looked forward and made plans for the future. Then in Nehemiah chapter 3, when everybody's set in their place, he says, what does this have to do with us? Think about this. Do you have projects assigned to you? Do you have jobs to work on? How would Nehemiah help you complete those projects? Get or receive help? Make sure everyone's doing their part? Don't try and do everything all at once? Or make it personal? Make it personal and filled with passion. And then in Nehemiah chapter 4, it says, how does he respond? He ignored the comments. He didn't let the mean comments get to him, let them roll off his back, and focused on his work. He prayed. He took the issue to the one who could deal with it. He armed his people. A hammer in one hand, a sword in the other. The people were ready for battle. Satan tries to use Sanballat in your life to discourage you, but you cannot let him. Don't let their words get you down. Keep praying and keep working. In Nehemiah chapter 5, it says Nehemiah was angry. He wasn't focused on the work that he didn't know. He was so focused on the work, he didn't know what was going on with the people. But when he found out, he took issue with it and exposed all their actions. But then Nehemiah does something amazing. He sets an example for everyone to follow. He lends his own money to the poor. He gave his own food to the Jews who were in need. He just didn't tell the people what to do. He showed them. He showed them what to do. And then in chapter 6, finally, Jordan says, all of us have walls to build, work to do in service to God, faith to strengthen and work on. Let Nehemiah inspire you, rise, and build. That's a great lesson, isn't it? That has so much intrigue and excitement to it about Nehemiah and his life and trying to rebuild the wall with the people of God. Well, thanks for joining me today. Jody and I love you. We pray you stay safe and healthy. And so until I see you again, you take care of yourself.